Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Across the Sky, our Lee Enterprises weather podcast. I'm Matt Hollander, covering weather for all of Lee's Midwest websites, apps, and social media accounts from Chicago. And I'm joined by my fellow meteorologist, Joe Martucci with the Press of Atlantic City in New Jersey, Sean Sublett with the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Virginia, and Kirsten Lang, the Tulsa World in Oklahoma. Now, this week, there's really only one thing we can talk about, so we're just going to make the whole show about it, and that's Hurricane Ian. We're going to be looking back at the forecast, what it did as a major hurricane in Florida, what it did after it made another landfall in South Carolina, and then also chat a little bit about where we go from here. Now, as of this morning, when we're recording this, October 3rd, there have been 90 confirmed deaths caused by Hurricane Ian, 3 in Cuba, 83 in Florida, and 4 in North Carolina. And this number is likely to climb as search and rescue efforts continue. Of course, this is the saddest part about the storm, and our thoughts and prayers are absolutely with the friends and families of these victims. Now, guys, there's so much to discuss with this storm. I guess we'll start by going around and sharing our general thoughts. Joe, let's start with you. What were the big things that stood out to you about Ian?
Well, I think the big thing that stood out to me was how well the forecast pretty much played out. I mean, yes, there's going to be debate about was there over warning for Tampa when we should have focused on Fort Myers, but you could pretty much say, 4 or 5 days before that this storm was going to hit the west coast of Florida and was going to hit the west coast of Florida with some intensity here. And I think it just kind of ties it back to the bigger point of weather communication and, are we doing a good enough job of explaining the hazards and focusing on, or I should say, not focusing on the details too far out, but also giving people an idea of what's to come. I think overall, the forecast was good. Where it made landfall just outside of Cape Coral was within that cone for a good portion of the time. But that's pretty much my biggest takeaway from this.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that, Joe. The macro or the large scale forecasting was very strong from the get-go. The problem we're running into now is I think that we're a victim of our own success and that we can be reasonably precise. And that's what people want. If it's a town versus a town 15 miles farther off up the coast, there will be different impacts. One of the things that I have not seen much about, there's a lot of focus obviously on the point, and we all know don't focus on the point. The hurricane's not a point. The impact's well away from the point, and you hear a lot of people who have kind of Monday morning quarterback. Well, they didn't think it was going to go here. They didn't think it was going to go there. And it's not an it. One of the things I did not see that much in messaging, which I would have liked to have seen. And again, I will fully admit I was on vacation last week. So I was following it, obviously. But I wasn't following it as intensely as I might normally would have. But the fact that I think where the communication could be better, it can always be better for one thing, but reminding people that it's not just a point, but the point is important because the wind around it is in a counterclockwise fashion. So if you were on the right side, and I mean physically the right side of this hurricane, you're going to get worse surge. We all saw the alerts 2-3 days out about Tampa Bay. Oh my heavens, what if this thing surges into Tampa Bay? So what happens? It comes in south of Tampa Bay, and Tampa Bay, the water all rushes out into the Gulf. And what people thought was 7 or 8 feet of water, now the bay is actually empty. So to somebody who's just looking at that, if they've mentally checked out a couple of days before landfall and they thought, oh, we're going to get 7 feet of water, then they don't check out what's going on. They turn around and see the bay empty. They're going to be like, WTF, what in the heck is going on? So I think there's a lot that needs to be improved with messaging, especially with surge, because I think we all know if that thing had come in 30 miles, 40 miles farther north, we're having an entirely different conversation about Tampa Bay, right? But the fact that 5 days out, it was this close, as you said, Joe, everybody knew it was coming into the west coast of Florida. The question was going to be, Was it going to be in Metro Tampa Bay, or was it going to be closer to Fort Myers? And ended up being closer to Fort Myers.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Tampa Bay was under a mandatory evacuation, but as you got closer towards Fort Myers, they were, zone E, and they kind of went down in priority as far as evacuation. Isn't that correct?
I don't know the southwestern and west coast of Florida evacuation zones well enough. I will say this, that I got a text from my sister who has friends down in Fort Myers, Cape Coral, and she asked me on Sunday, should they leave? I said I would need 36 more hours. So I get up Tuesday and I'm looking at the shifting and the track. I'm like, they should leave. So I told her, I said, tell your friends Tuesday morning they should leave, and they need to be gone before dark. Don't mess around, no playing, go out to West Palm or something like that.
So I'm just basing this off of a friend of mine that lived in Sarasota, and I kept telling them, you need to evacuate. It's probably best if you did. And they were like, well, we're under zone E, and they tell us not to do it because they said that we'll clog the roads because of the other mandatory evacuations that are taking place farther north. And so that's where my information's coming from. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but that was someone that was in Sarasota versus another person I know that was in St. Petersburg, and they were under mandatory evacuation. So they did have to leave. Sorry, Joe, I cut you off.
No. I was just trying to fill in. So on Tuesday, Lee County, which is where Fort Myers is, that was where the mandatory evacuations went into place. So it was first in, I think, zone A, and then going to B, and then going to C. But it made landfall on Wednesday afternoon. So you're talking about we'll say a generous 36 hours in advance, and at worst case, 18 hours in advance to evacuate. Usually you like those numbers to be really, 48 hours for a mandatory evacuation. We had that here in New Jersey with Sandy and Irene the year before that. So, the evacuations did come out a little bit later. There's always Monday morning quarterbacking on this kind of stuff. And, it's weather meteorologists are usually the scapegoats for a lot of this. And, it's unfortunate. And I think if we're wrong, we're wrong, but I don't think we were wrong on this one. There was plenty of notice that, both Fort Myers and Tampa were most at risk. I think the fair question is, did we place too much emphasis on Tampa when there was just an equal shot of Fort Myers getting something from this as well? So, and that all comes down to the hurricane cone. And, is the cone the best way to explain things? Is there something better to do? Do we need to put the line in the middle of the cone? Do we need to put that little dot that shows it's a category 1 or a category 2 in the middle of that cone? I personally don't use that little line that goes through the cone because I don't want people to think the center track is the most preferred track. But I do leave those little icons in there. Maybe the icons aren't worth it either. Those are all little questions to be asked, but they're important.
I agree with the line in the middle of the cone. I think that's a mistake. And I think this storm is a good example of why that is a mistake. Because I think, certainly with the public, but I think you could also say for some meteorologists, we got a little too focused about the center of the cone and where the worst impacts are going to be. And with it, each update, it was kind of a focus on the center instead of looking at all the possibilities. And what I go back to look at is really Sunday evening, because I think Sunday evening was the key time, because I think Sunday evening is when a lot of folks, they were kind of tuned out over the weekend and were like, okay, something's happening. But at this point, remember that on Sunday evening, this had just become a tropical storm. It hadn't even made landfall in Cuba yet. And people knew that Florida had a threat, but I think, again, there was so much uncertainty. People folks kind of were doing stuff over the weekend and weren't really focusing. But I think Sunday evening was the key time. And if you look at the National Hurricane Center's forecasted cone that came out 8 o'clock in the evening on Sunday evening, it's wide. It was going all the way almost to the Florida-Alabama line, not quite, but it was in the panhandle. And then it stretched all the way to the south, guess where? Cape Coral, Fort Myers. So at that time, Sunday evening, Cape Coral and Fort Myers were in the cone, but they were on the edge of the cone. They were not in the center of the cone. And so everybody started focusing in on the center and maybe a landfall, maybe even in the Big Bend of Florida at this point. But from that point on, the forecast just started shifting south, south, south. But Sunday evening, there was the chance, the Hurricane Center put it in their cone, that Fort Myers and Cape Coral could see the center of the storm move over them. So there was that chance even Sunday evening, and they were always in the cone, but they just weren't in the center of the cone until the last minute.
And one of the other things with that, Matt, is I've just pulled up the Tuesday evening advisory here, and we could talk about the cone all we want, the ins and outs of that. But I'm looking at this map right now from the 8 p.m. Tuesday advisory, and metropolitan Fort Myers, Naples, they're in a hurricane warning, even though they're not in a cone. So this goes back to what we said before with the cone. This also goes into the orientation of the coastline, the angle of attack with the storm, how, all those things matter when we start talking about these smaller scale impacts, because we all know it hits the fan near the eye wall. That's why as much as we tell people don't focus on the eye, we know the worst is going to be near the eye wall. We know that's where the surge is going to be, on the right side of the storm. I think these are some of the things that we need to message a little bit better. We can say, yes, it's a big thing. Don't focus on the point, but the point is still important. And this is why, because the worst will be within 15 or 20 miles of that point, and on the right side because the thing spins in a counterclockwise fashion, that's going to push all the water on the shore. I think these are things that need to be messaged better. And again, the other thing is that and I'm not going to, Lee County, whatever, that's where it hit. Fine. I don't know anybody in Lee County EM. Don't know them. I don't know where they got their information from. Did they just look at a cone and make a decision? Did they call the Hurricane Center? Did they call the local forecast office? How much communication was there? Would there have been some better information coming from the local forecast office in Southwest Florida? Hey, because they know intuitively where the evacuation zones are all the time. Not to say that you don't know it at the Hurricane Center, but these are the things I always question. How good is the information emergency managers are getting? Because as we talked with our EM colleague, Ashley Morris, a few weeks ago, there is a wide variety of professionalism with emergency management across this country. Okay. And again, I don't know anything about Lee County other than that's where Fort Myers is. All right. I don't know. But it does raise the point that we need to be sure that there is professionalism done here between EMs, law enforcement, meteorologists, local meteorologists, not just the Hurricane Center. And so, it wasn't in the cone, blah, blah, blah. That's not an excuse. That is not an excuse. Saying I wasn't in the cone is not an excuse. The cone's important, but it ain't everything.
Hey, well, speaking of the cone, right? I mean, and I think this gets lost a lot. The cone's only a 66% probability of the center of the storm making landfall within that cone. So there is a third chance that it stays outside of that cone. And I, from my little soapbox, think that we should make it more 75% chance. I think our forecasts have gotten so much better compared to 20 years ago that we can do that. But that's also important as well.
But, I think messaging the impacts, the cone is a good place to start, but it's not everything. My concern is that a lot of the public sees the cone as everything, and it's just not. It's just not. And that's where the people on the ground in the local areas need to pick up the slack. The local meteorologists on the ground need to pick up the slack in Fort Myers, Tampa, on those locations, the local forecast office. And again, I wasn't down there, so I don't know what the local folks said. But if an EM is only listening to the Hurricane Center and they're not taking advantage of other expertise in their backyard, then they're missing out.
And I think another problem is that, people look at the forecast and then they think that it's not going to change. I still think we have a problem with that. And especially when you're 4 or 5 days out, people see a forecast and then assume that it's not going to change. And it just, we try and stress this, but I still think there's this conception that's like, okay, that's what the forecast is, and I don't need to check it anymore. I can make plans now. And it's like, no, you have to keep checking back because this is likely going to change. There's still things that we don't know. And so I think people get locked in, and there was that whole focus. And I think it did get a little carried away when the forecast first started trending south, and it looked like a worst case scenario for Tampa and St. Petersburg and Clearwater. And like, Jim Cantori's going there to Tampa and Clearwater, and that causes a huge blow up on social media. It's like, Cantori's here. This is where it's going to make landfall. And this is where the center of the cone is now. And everybody just focused in on that. We spent almost 24 hours just focused on Tampa and what's going to happen in Tampa and what are folks doing there. And we kind of forgot about folks north of Tampa, south of Tampa. And like, I think people in Fort Myers and Cape Coral are like, oh, it's going to be in Tampa, so no worries here. It's not going to be that bad, until it started shifting farther south, because we were too far out at that point to be getting so specific with the forecast and trying to draw conclusions about this is where it's going to make landfall. I wish we could. And one day, I think we're going to get there where we could be more certain several days out, farther out than we are now. But right now, you just can't. You got to stay, all right, this is the current situation, but look at all the possibilities. Look what's still in play. Look what we don't know. You really got to stress that and tell people to keep checking back in. Don't focus on this forecast now. We are not at the final decision point. So I think we just have to stress that things can change even in the final 24 hours. Unfortunately, there are going to be updates. So you just have to stay tuned with the latest information.
I'm going to shift, if that's okay, and go back to what Sean was talking about with storm surge. I reached out to Jordan Jones after this happened. I was writing a story for the Sunday paper about it. And I asked her a question that I had received, and it was, will the Saffir-Simpson scale be altered in the future to account for storm surge or the size of the storm? After Ian, the surge and the size was so massive that it would have seemed to be a Category 5 hurricane, but it wasn't. And her response was, yes, the Saffir-Simpson scale is insufficient in accounting for damage like storm surge and flooding, since these impacts aren't necessarily dependent on intensity. There have been recent studies suggesting that pressure changes in hurricane are a better indicator of damage because it takes into consideration both the size and the intensity of the storm. She also said that there doesn't seem to be a good indicator of hurricane-related landfall to measure impacts from flash flooding. And then she said, I don't think the Saffir-Simpson scale will be extended, but I think we'll probably see other scales being introduced in the future and use them in tandem to account for more varied hurricane impact and damage scenarios. What do y'all think about that?
I agree. I just think that's it's going to take a long time to fully change that, because you got to change all the records, historical records, and got to teach people, and us included, right? How we're going to communicate it. But yeah, I mean, listen, I think as we evolve over time, things evolve. And, here's the other thing too, right? In addition to the pressure changes, one downside of the Saffir-Simpson scale is it's only saying maximum sustained winds. It doesn't even tell you what the winds are 30 miles out. Going back to this storm, is Ian the same storm as Charlie? That came through. I can't remember what year was. Sean, you know what year it was?
I don't remember. I'm so old, I forget now.
2004. But the point is, the eye of Charlie was like, a third of the eye of Ian. Ian was a much bigger storm. So does that play into account things? I think we have the ability to do that, to take in all these variables, how big things are, and how strong the winds are, and how heavy the rain is in the surge. But I just think it's a big effort. I think we can do it. It's just a big effort.
Yeah, I think it's too late to get rid of the Saffir-Simpson scale in some ways, because the public has become so accustomed to it in the categories, Category 1, Category 2, and then watch out for the Category 5. And we base, so much on hurricane history on that scale too, when you're keeping track of what kind of a storm made landfall. Did it make landfall as a Category 2, Category 3? So to completely get rid of the scale, I just don't see that happening. But I do think we can get better at saying, and I think we're trying to do this, and that's the question, is do we introduce new scales? I'm not sure if that's the answer, because I think that could lead to confusion. I think the key is, yes, there's a scale that talks about the wind, but you have to remember that it's not about the wind. And I think this storm is a great example of that, because it's been a while since we've had a major storm surge event in a populated area. Even in 2020 and 2021, we had some big storms that caused a lot of wind damage, but the storm surge was in pretty remote areas, not hitting very populated areas. And so we never really saw a good recent example of storm surge damage, but boy, did we absolutely see that this time. And this was a great example of how the damage on the right side of the eye wall is worse than the left side of the eye wall. Even though the winds are the same, if you're on that right side, you're going to get that onshore flow and the worst of that storm surge. Meanwhile, on the left side, you're not going to get nearly as bad as the storm surge. And that's what we saw. Even in a really short distance, you can see where the damage was way worse in the Fort Myers area versus just to the west of Fort Myers, where they didn't get that storm surge. And so if you get the winds and the storm surge, that's where the absolute worst damage is. And that's where the center of the storm does. That's where the center is important, because somebody's going to get it the worst. The combination of that storm surge and that wind, that's when you get the catastrophic damage. And I do think that was good wording by the National Hurricane Center. I mean, in the final 12 to 24 hours, they were using that strong wording: catastrophic storm surge, catastrophic flooding, catastrophic winds. And that's absolutely what we saw. So the messaging was getting out there. And it was strong wording they were putting out there, and it was absolutely warranted, because we're seeing the aftermath of it now.
Agreed. I mean, the messaging did get ratcheted up, but I think your point was also very well taken, Matt, is that people see a forecast and it doesn't look like they're close 2 or 3 days out, and then they forget about it. And we as a community need to emphasize, like, this isn't the end all be all. Things change. One of the things I would like to see, and I don't know how we would do this, I would need to talk to some social scientists, would be to introduce all clear zones. This is where it is absolutely positively not going. I'm not sure how that would look, but since people like to check out, okay, I'm out, oh, look, I'm in the all clear zone. I don't have to worry about this anymore. And if that's the case, the only place that's really all clear is basically west of New Orleans. So everybody needs to continue to pay attention. I don't know what that would look like, but I think that does add some level of some beneficial information to the public. This is absolutely positively not going to affect you going down the road. All right. But we don't do any of that right now.
No, I totally agree with you there, Sean. I'm not going to name any names, but I did see that weekend, Saturday and Sunday before the storm, even on, I think it was Sunday morning, there were some news providers that were talking about the entire Gulf Coast needs to be on alert for this potential hurricane. I was like, no, the entire Gulf Coast does not need to be on alert. At that point, it was very obvious that anyone west of Alabama did not need to be worried about this storm, but there was talk about the entire Gulf Coast needs to be on alert. And I felt like that just, at that point, it makes us look like we have no idea what's going to happen. And that's just not true. We knew that Florida was going to be the main camp. At one point, there was some model still hinting at, maybe an Alabama landfall, but it was never west of that. And so the fact that people in Brownsville, Texas, and the Rio Grande Valley of Texas did not need to be worried about the storm. Nobody in the Texas coast needed to be worried about the storm. There were news outlets talking about the whole Gulf Coast on alert. And I just hated to see that when it was, maybe a week before that could have been warranted, but not the weekend before. That was just so unnecessary. And I saw that. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that's where it comes back into, like, we need to make it clear who has a chance of seeing this and who does not. And so we don't have to worry folks unnecessarily. With that, I think it's time to take a short break. We're definitely not done yet, because we've been talking about Florida, but we still have to talk about what Ian did after it left Florida. Also going to talk about lessons that can be learned from this storm and what we can expect in the future. So stick around, more Across the Sky right after this break.
Michael J. for Hope for the Warriors. Started back in 2006 at Camp Lejeune. Military families witnessing the effects of war on their loved ones. Now, almost 20 years later, they've aided over 53,000 service members, veterans, and families with confidential, high-quality behavioral health care services at little or no cost to post 9/11 vets and their families. Over 91% of every dollar donated goes directly to the programs. If you're as concerned about our heroes as I am, go to hopeforthewarriors.org.
Welcome back, everyone. Matt Holliner here with the rest of the Lee Weather Team, Joe Martucci, Sean Sublett, and Kirsten Lang. Before we continue our review of Hurricane Ian, there's something pretty neat that's going to be happening the next couple of weeks. Here's NASA Ambassador Tony Rice with this week's astronomy report.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
October will be great to spot Mercury in the pre-dawn sky, especially this week and next. That first rock from the sun reaches greatest elongation, or the separation in our sky from the sun. This makes tiny Mercury, which is more often hidden in the sun's glare, much easier to see. Mercury also reaches its highest above the horizon on Saturday morning. To find it, look low on the eastern horizon between an hour and half hour before sunrise. Elsewhere, in Washington, or actually in low Earth orbit, the FCC approved new rules last week governing the disposal of defunct spacecraft. Previously, satellite operators had 25 years to deorbit once they'd reached their end of life. But these new rules require them to dispose of them as soon as is practical and within 5 years. While everyone in Washington seems to agree that space junk is a problem, there's much less agreement on the steps to address it. That FCC decision prompted criticism from Congress, specifically the House Science Committee, who questioned the agency's authority to create such rules. Satellite operators also took issue, asking for a waiver process. But when you look at the numbers, straight from U.S. Space Command, that is responsible for monitoring everything in orbit, including debris, the space industry has been doing a pretty good job of making progress recently. Looking just at rocket bodies, those upper stages of rockets that are used to push the payloads into their final orbit, big debris like that has gone from spending an average of about 2.5 years in orbit back in 2000 to an average of about 8 days for payloads that were launched this year. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
Thanks, Tony. I'll definitely be checking that one out. Now, getting back to our discussion of Hurricane Ian, as devastating as the storm was over Florida, I think the part that amazed me the most was what happened after the storm left Florida. You know, so many times a storm makes landfall in the U.S. and it either curves back out to sea or it moves inland and dissipates, but not this storm. Yes, it moved back out in the Atlantic, but then it re-strengthened and incredibly curved back towards the U.S. to make another hurricane landfall in Georgetown, South Carolina as a Category 1 with 85-mile-per-hour winds. And guys, I got to tell you, the images that came out of South Carolina, those are pretty scary as well. I mean, I think this would have been a big story on its own, even without what happened in Florida.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that either. I mean, and like we talked about before the break, the angle at which the storm came into the South Carolina coast, optimal. I don't say worst case scenario, but it was optimal for storm surge, right? Coming in almost straight from southeast to northwest back into the South Carolina coastline, almost perpendicular to the coastline. In addition to the heavy rain, the freshwater flooding, the wind energy. I mean, mercifully, yes, there was wind damage, but it did not have the wind impact like they had at the Florida coastline. But nonetheless, still plenty of damage, lots of cleanup that needs to be done there, and the South Carolina coast as well. But it's very instructive because the other problem we have with this is the nomenclature. It was very close to starting to lose its tropical characteristics. And Joe, it started to remind me of Sandy as it began to make landfall into South Carolina, because you started to see it becoming this hybrid system. And you always worry about changing the name. Well, it's post-tropical. Well, what does that actually mean? Then you've got to go and explain what that means, but it doesn't really matter to what's going to happen to you. Impacts don't change. The nomenclature it's important for scientific processes, for record keeping, but in terms of what's hitting you upside the head, what it's called doesn't matter. And that's still a problem because it's very difficult, because as soon as it lost its hurricane status, the top winds went below 75, it was suddenly post-tropical.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that in our October 24th episode of the podcast when we have our 10 years later Sandy episode. But, you're right, Sean. That kind of nomenclature and talking about post-tropical or, is it tropical? doesn't really matter when it's on your doorstep. The storm does not care if it's tropical or not tropical. It's going to bring surge. It's going to bring wind. It's going to bring rain. We certainly had a good amount of that in South Carolina. Granted, it still was tropical, but hey, listen, we're recording this on October 3rd. I'm sitting here in New Jersey on October 3rd, and we are in the midst of 5 days of coastal flooding, 5 days of rain here, and 5 days of wind and pretty significant tidal flooding. So, it doesn't matter necessarily if the storm is tropical or not. There are still impacts either way.
And another example that New Jersey was never in the cone for Ian, but absolutely getting impact. So another example of how the cone isn't everything.
And plus, is this even Ian anymore? Right? I mean, again, this is all a messaging conundrum. Is it the same broad-based circulation? Yeah, it is. But then you have this upper level feature that comes in and reforms the cyclone, but it's a mid-latitude cyclone now, but it was the same circuit, but how much of that matters to the individual person? I'm walking out with a friend of mine this morning. They're like, is this Ian? Well, yeah, kinda, but not exactly. And, and these things are just so thorny and so complicated.
It is complicated. And, there is even a little bit of rumblings here in the mid-Atlantic about would Ian be named again as a tropical storm going off the Virginia coast. There was a little bit of talk, at least in my New Jersey weather community, about that. Obviously, it is not. It's pretty much a nor'easter at this point. But yeah, the name, naming is important, and we need a naming. It helps stick it, memorize things in our head, but it's not everything. There are plenty of other storms without a name that bring tremendous impacts to the area as well, especially if you're in the Northeast.
The other thing that stood out to me is that, there's so many little things that end up mattering with these storms, because one thing that Ian did, which was a good thing in Florida, as bad as it was, and as big of a rainmaker as it was, it did actually move a little bit faster than expected across Florida. And because it did that, it got on to the other side of Florida a little bit stronger than we were expecting. We thought it would weaken even more as it moved across Florida, just because it was going to be over land for a longer amount of time. But it came out on the other side of Florida with around 70 mile per hour winds. I mean, it was almost still a hurricane. It was a strong tropical storm when it was back in the Atlantic. And as soon as I saw that, and Hurricane Center did too, it's like, this thing is not going to be a tropical storm when it makes landfall. It's additional landfall in South Carolina. It's going to be a hurricane again because it's back over open water. It is going to strengthen. And then initially the forecast was just for 75 miles per hour. I was like, no, it's going to be stronger than that. And so, sure enough, the Hurricane Center upped the forecast to 85 miles per hour. And that's ultimately what it was. But because it moved faster over Florida, that ended up impacting South Carolina because it ended up being a stronger storm because it started stronger when it moved back into the Atlantic. So all these little things matter. The speed at which it was moving ended up being a critical factor for South Carolina and North Carolina and that area, making impact as a hurricane instead of a tropical storm.
I had some more friends that were in Tampa, and they were actually encouraged to evacuate to Orlando. And so they ended up probably getting, I don't know if I want to say worse condition. Obviously, you don't deal with a storm surge when you're in Orlando, but I mean, the winds and the amount of rainfall that they got just being, evacuated in a hotel in Orlando may have been more so than what they would have seen had they just stayed in Tampa. But
quite popular, Kirsten.
Oh, well, I don't know what it is. Texas ties. A lot of people head over to Florida. I'm not sure. I just randomly have friends and family members down there.
The inland flooding that you get with these storms cannot be ignored. And a lot of Florida that was well inland dealing with that. And what I think one of the most amazing things that we're still dealing with in Florida is what happened several days after Ian made landfall. So we were talking about it this weekend, how all of that water was draining into the rivers, and places that hadn't flooded yet flooded because of all this water and the rising river levels. So I think it was Arcadia, Florida, just seeing terrible flooding days after the hurricane had left Florida because of all the runoff from those huge rainfall amounts, 12, 15, 19 inches of rain. That water, it can only go down for so long. It can only soak into the ground. Otherwise, it's going to run off. It's going to flow into the rivers, and the rivers some places are just now cresting days later, just from all that rain that fell. I mean, just some truly incredible rainfall amounts, especially in Florida, but also in the Carolinas and the flooding that occurred there. And let's also not forget the tornado warnings, the tornadoes that occurred in Florida, in South Florida, actually on the southeastern part of Florida. There were tornadoes. You always have to remember that with these hurricanes too, all of the impact of these things. I mean, that's why hurricanes get so much focus. That's why they're the most incredible weather out there, because you can have tornadoes within the hurricanes and the tropical storms, and we dealt with that too. I mean, we really saw it all with this storm.
Going back to the name of the hurricane, my husband's name is Ian, and so
How do you like that?
I know. So before it hit, I was sitting here in the kitchen, and he was looking at me, and he goes, "So this is going to be kind of a big one, isn't it?" I was like, "Yeah," and he goes, "Yeah." And he was like, "So my name's going to be like on all these headlines, isn't it?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to save those." Monster Ian, all this stuff. But yeah, it's funny I was telling my editor this, actually, he knows my husband's name, and he brought up a good point too. He was like, I wonder how that, people named Katrina, or people named, Andrew or Ian. I wonder, how that, not that it impacts them in any way really, but it's just kind of a funny thing to think about, because, you hear that name over and over and over. And then unfortunately, like with this storm, it can have some, negative connotation to where it's then, retired and not used anymore. And people will remember the name Ian. And I even think too, if you, in the future, if you have, this might sound silly, but when you're thinking about maybe naming a child, okay, and you think, oh, Katrina would be a pretty name, but then the first thing you might think about is the hurricane that made landfall and, killed so many people. I wonder if Ian starts to, kind of make that list too. I'm sure it will, with as many deaths as it's had, unfortunately.
Yeah, I bet that name loses a lot of popularity in Florida. That's for sure. Nobody's going to want to name their kid Ian after this one. But I will say, if you're an Ian, the good or bad news is I think it's almost a done deal that this name is going to be retired, with the huge impacts, the billions of dollars in damage, the death toll that continues to climb. I mean, this name is going to be retired. So there is not going to be another Hurricane Ian after this. They're going to have to come up with another I storm, which there have been a lot of I names that have been retired. I don't know what other I name they're going to come up with at this point.
What is it with the ice storms,
out.
Right? I mean, there've been so many of the ice storms that have been so bad. Whether here in Virginia, Irene was a really bad one. But
I gotta think it's the time of year.
Yeah,
I mean, like you start making your way down the list, and you start getting towards the
Ivan. These are just
and I think what we've we're starting to get into the final part of the show, but I think we've got to chat a little bit about where do we go from here? What are the lessons learned? And I think the first thing that stands out to me is, man, if there's not wind shear or dry air in the Gulf of Mexico, and you get a storm that moves into the Gulf of Mexico in July, August, September, or October, particularly those 4 months, maybe not so much June and November, but the water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico are so warm at this point. If you don't have wind shear, if you don't have dry air, I think you almost have to assume that if a storm gets in the Gulf without the wind shear, without the dry air, it's probably going to make it to major hurricane street, because we keep seeing that happen. If there's no wind shear, there's no dry air, these storms just explode. I mean, Ian was another example, and it shocked me how overnight it just shot up by about 30 miles per hour in such a short amount of time. When it left Cuba and got back over that warm water and there was no wind shear and no dry air, it just exploded. And this has happened before with Michael, with the storms that made landfall in Louisiana. So I think you just have to assume, if there's no wind shear and there's no dry air in the Gulf, like, plan on it being a major hurricane, plan on rapid strengthening, and be prepared for a big one.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. I mean, unless there's some other environmental condition to push this thing into a weaker state, this time of year, up until the middle of October, when that water is still very warm, then you've got to expect some kind of rapid intensification. And let's talk about the climate change thing for a minute. And Capucci, to his credit, tweeted something out that I thought was valuable this morning, was that there are things you can say and there are things you can't. I mean, we know very well that you can't say, oh, all of a sudden there's going to be a whole bunch of hurricanes all the time. No, 2020, 2021, we're kind of freakish, right? But what we do know is that they tend to be stronger farther to the north. There is evidence that rapid intensification is more likely. The rain is going to be heavier. There's also some evidence that they are going to slow down, which makes the rain heavier. I always kind of cringe when everybody wants to blame climate change, because it's just not that straightforward. It's not a one-to-one comparison. There are impacts, and the impacts are bad, but we have hurricanes. Hurricanes have always been there, and they're always going to be there. But in the long term, it does look like when they do occur, the impacts are going to be worse. I mean, that's the short version of it. And I think there was already one or two rapid attribution studies suggesting that the rain's about 10% heavier. And I tell people, in the elevator for 15 or 20 seconds, what does it mean for heavy rain? Overall, to a first approximation or first guess, the rains are going to be 10, 15% heavier nowadays than it used to be, because of a warming climate, warmer air, warmer water, more evaporation. You're going to get more rain.
Yeah. You're correct, Sean. I got nothing really more to say to that. Not necessarily more storms, but the storms that do happen, stronger, but also strengthening at a quickening pace as well. And we've seen that, and we will continue to see that. I did actually see an interesting stat, which was the number of landfalling hurricanes in Florida have actually decreased over time. I tend to chalk it up to coincidence more than anything else.
Me too.
Just something out there in the Twitterverse that I saw over the weekend.
Yeah, I think trying to correlate that to landfalls is a fool's errand, really, until we have maybe 200 or 300 years worth of data. Because we know also that the Atlantic Basin, which includes the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, that has the largest year-to-year fluctuation in any place else in the world that gets hurricanes / tropical cyclones. More than the Western Pacific, more than the Eastern Pacific, more than the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic is where there's more variation from year to year than in any other part of the world. So trying to pin everything on one or two causes is exceedingly difficult.
Not sure if I want to go here or not, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to take what might be considered a hot take, but I think I think it's the elephant in the room at this point. You can make a strong argument that we should not be building any homes right on the coast, right on the beach, and the Gulf Coast through the mid-Atlantic. I'll leave the Northeast in there. You can have your beach homes there. The West Coast, you can have your beach homes there. But I'm sorry, I really just don't think it is a good idea to have a house right on the beach along the Gulf Coast or anywhere East Coast south of New Jersey. It's going to happen.
Wow, look at that.
You're going to get hit by one of these storms, your house at some point, maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not in this generation, but it's going to happen. The Fort Myers area is a good example. They were hit by Charlie in 2004, not as bad, but that area saw Charlie in 2004, and here we are 18 years later with Ian. And so, I think it's safe to say that, it's a good chance that in another 18 years, there's going to be another one. And should we really rebuild these homes that got destroyed right on the beach? Now, inland, I get it. Everybody wants to have that beach house. I know it's the dream. It's great. But honestly, if you can, I think we should just build inland, and then you drive and you go visit the beach. But don't put your house on the beach, because then you're leaving yourself open for that terrible storm surge. And there was talk about some communities not being as hard hit, a little bit inland from Fort Myers. And that's just because they're inland. They didn't have to deal with the storm surge. And so I really don't think anybody should be building homes on the beach. And when they get destroyed, I hate to say it, but I don't think they should be rebuilt.
Well, that goes back to touch on that point, Matt. I think, it depends on how much risk you're willing to take on, but also more importantly, how we look at flood insurance and other insurance in this country. That's another whole big thing to be sure, how we subsidize risk in some parts of the country more than others. And we don't have time to go into that right now. But I will say this. I think we could certainly do a much better job of introducing natural defenses to flooding along the coast. We have ripped up so many natural defenses along the coast in the last century, last 100, 120 years, especially in Florida, that, this is going to keep happening until we figure out a way to engineer this better. If people are going to want to flock into the coast, I don't think that's going to go away. But I do think there is some wisdom in not having a house 200 or 300 yards away from the shoreline. If you want to have wonderful beaches there, but not have a house that's 100 yards or less from a tide line, from a regular high tide line, I think makes a lot of sense. But as you said, Matt, this is not a problem we're going to fix in 5 minutes.
As the shore resident who lives in apparently the Northeast, I didn't know, Matt. I thought we lived in the Mid Atlantic. We live in the Northeast, Matt.
Arguable.
No, I'm going to say
that's okay. I'll take either.
The Mid Atlantic ends in Maryland, and then once you go across the Delaware Bay, then you're in the Northeast. Jersey Shore upwards is the Northeast. For my money, of course, we could go back into the Central Jersey thing after we have a few more drinks, Joe.
That's absolutely correct. But let me be the one to say that Cape May, New Jersey is the same latitude as Washington, D.C.
Yes, sir.
So there's so much New Jersey south of where Maryland is.
People forget that. People do forget how far south Cape May actually is.
That is absolutely correct. Listen, when I go down to Cape May, I get that nice tropical tan when I get down there. Changes in latitude, changes in attitude over in Cape May. But anyway, on a serious note, we could talk about this for a while. And I talk a lot about this on a daily basis with people. There's a reason why barrier islands are called barrier islands. They're to protect the mainland. And up until about 150 years ago, people really didn't live on barrier islands. So this is a relatively new phenomenon. Now, I will at least speak for New Jersey. I think that we as a whole do a very good job of protecting against the oceanside flooding. New Jersey is essentially a sand dune, or I should say, has a wall from Cape May all the way up to Sandy Hook. The problem is what happens on the bay side. And we have a lot of homes that are built on the water. And I've been to homes on the water. They're very nice. You get to go jet skiing right out the back door and you're hopping on and you're out in 5 minutes. But that being said, when you do have a storm, you have problems. There are programs, at least in New Jersey, that will buy out people's homes that voluntarily want to be bought out in some of these areas. This turns into a social justice issue because a lot of these homes that are being bought are in areas where the home values are low. So, for example, you're not going to go to Ocean City, New Jersey and buy out many homes, but you might go to Atlantic City, New Jersey and buy out homes. So, it's very complicated. I think that's a lot has to do with the state level and the local level. But to the overall point, yes, barrier islands and being built on barrier islands comes with an inherent risk of, oh crap, we're going to flood. And that's an issue.
But I think the people that are building like Sean said, they understand the risk. They know what they're building on. They know what they're getting into. And I think it's going to be those types of people. It'll be really hard to convince them otherwise. Even though they understand the risk, they'll still want to always live on the ocean right there on the beach.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think if you're built on the water, but I will say there are people who live inland on the barrier islands. I'm using air quotes. No one can see it except for me, but air quotes. That don't know that they flood on occasion and they're surprised. So, you're right though, Kirsten. I think most people know that risk. And you just hope that those people have flood insurance because that can be a very costly cleanup.
Yeah, that's what always surprises me too. I can't believe, for example, how many people stayed on Sanibel Island. And now all the rescues that are having to occur there with the road is completely washed out. You can't drive back to the mainland anymore. So they're having to rescue people from boats and helicopters. And it's amazing. Why did these people stay? Now, I know there are some situations where people literally can't. There's there's medical reasons, for some people, they're worried about they can't evacuate and go someplace to take their pets because there's a whole issue with some shelters don't allow pets. And so they don't want to leave their pets. So there are some extenuating circumstances, but there are other people that could absolutely leave. You don't have to stay. And it just always amazes me. It happens in every storm. These people who do live on the beach, they make that choice. They take that risk to have that beach home or live on the barrier island. And then when the storm is coming, and there's this very strong messaging telling you how bad it's going to be, these people seem to still ignore it and say, I don't think it's going to be that bad. I'm going to ride it out. It's like
optimism bias.
It's
called optimism bias. Totally a thing. Optimism bias is totally a thing.
Because that's, what's resulting in, and partly what's resulting in this death toll is people who are told to evacuate who didn't. If you're told to evacuate, we just can't stress that enough. Please do so. There's a reason why you're being told to evacuate. It's obviously we don't want to do it unnecessarily. Yeah, but if you're told to evacuate, we know this is a life-threatening situation. Don't take unnecessary risk. Listen to these warnings. And if it ends up not being as bad as thought, oh well, but don't take that chance, because you're seeing what happens for people who said, well, let's see if it probably won't be that bad. People are unfortunately dying. So if you're told to evacuate, if you live on the beach and a hurricane is headed your way, you have to leave. You're going to have to leave your house. I know it's a hard thing to do, and you think your house is a safe place, especially after COVID-19. We were told to shelter in our homes. Our homes are safe. Well, in a hurricane, if your home is on the beach, it is not a safe place, and you have to get out. You have to leave. Otherwise, you're putting your life in serious danger. Any other thoughts, guys, before we wrap it up?
No, I think we've done a pretty thorough job here.
Yeah, I think we covered, but I felt like we had to do an episode on Ian. This is just what a storm. I mean, clearly we filled a whole episode and we could probably go on talking about it, but I guess we'll put this one in the books. Now, looking ahead to next week, we're going to focus back in on weather communication, which we've kind of already started discussing in this episode, but specifically we want to talk about communication with watches and warnings when it comes to the growing Spanish-speaking population. Are we getting that message out effectively for folks that English isn't their first language? So I think it's going to be a real interesting episode. Hope you join for that one as well. But in the meantime, for Lee Enterprises, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, Sean Sublett in Richmond, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Matt Hollander in Chicago. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care. We'll catch you again soon.
Michael J. for Hope for the Warriors. Started back in 2006 at Camp Lejeune. Military families witnessing the effects of war on their loved ones. Now, almost 20 years later, they've aided over 53,000 service members, veterans, and families with confidential, high-quality behavioral health care services at little or no cost to post 9/11 vets and their families. Over 91% of every dollar donated goes directly to the programs. If you're as concerned about our heroes as I am, go to hopeforthewarriors.org.